You can't just walk away from this deal, David.
Watch me.
It started like any peaceful morning on a cliffside property that most people would only dream of owning. The kind of place where the ocean stretches endlessly into the horizon, where the wind feels clean, and where silence is worth more than gold. But for me, that silence didn't last. Because one morning I opened my security camera feed and saw something that made absolutely no sense. A bright red SUV was parked directly across my driveway, blocking it completely. No warning, no note, no reason. And leaning against that vehicle, arms crossed like she owned the entire coastline, was a woman I would later come to know as the HOA president, the so-called Karen of the neighborhood. Now here's the part that made everything worse. She wasn't just blocking my driveway, and she was hosting what looked like a small neighborhood gathering right on my access road. People were standing around laughing, taking photos of the ocean view like it was a public attraction. But it wasn't public. That road, legally mine, every inch of it, and she had no idea. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding, maybe a mistake, maybe she didn't know. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I went outside. That's when things escalated in a way I could never have predicted. She didn't apologize. She didn't move. Instead, she looked at me like I was the intruder, like I was the one trespassing on my own property. And when I told her to move the vehicle, what she said next made my blood go cold. Because in her mind, the HOA had authority over everything in that neighborhood. Even my private road, even my legal access, even my property rights. There was a moment I realized this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding, and this was going to become a full-blown property war. And what she didn't know yet was that she had just made the biggest legal mistake of her entire life, because I wasn't just any homeowner, and that driveway she blocked was about to become the center of the most expensive HOA humiliation this community had ever seen. 3. The property had been in my possession for just over a year, but in that short time it had already become my sanctuary and a long stretch of private cliffside land carved naturally into the edge of the coastline, with a narrow driveway that curved like a ribbon toward the main house. From the outside, it looked like something out of a luxury magazine. From the inside, it felt like peace finally earned after years of struggle. But peace in neighborhoods like this is always temporary. The HOA had existed long before I moved in, and from day one I noticed a subtle tension. Rules that made no sense, and regulations that felt more like control than community maintenance. And a board that operated with the confidence of people who believed they were untouchable, especially the president. She was the type of person who didn't just enforce rules, she embodied them. She turned every small disagreement into a declaration of authority, and slowly she had built a reputation that made most neighbors avoid confrontation entirely. And I didn't. That morning began like any other. The ocean breeze carried through the open windows, and the sunlight reflected off the cliffside in a way that made everything look almost cinematic. I checked my phone, reviewed some work emails, and then opened my security camera feed out of habit. That's when I saw the SUV parked across my driveway, not slightly off and not temporarily paused, fully blocking access. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe a delivery mistake, maybe a visitor turned around incorrectly. But within seconds, I saw movement outside the vehicle. People stepping out, setting up chairs, taking photos. And that's when it hit me. And this wasn't a mistake, this was intentional. A small HOA viewing event had been set up right at the entrance of my private driveway, as if my property was part of their shared scenic attraction. Before I stepped outside, and the reality of it became even more absurd. The driveway, which legally belonged to me and served as the only access point to my home, had essentially been turned into a public walkway. The HOA president stood at the center of it all, completely composed, as if nothing about the situation was unusual. I approached calmly, expecting what any reasonable person would expect: Confusion followed by apology, followed by immediate correction. Instead, I got resistance. She claimed the road was part of HOA managed land. She insisted that it was community accessible during designated scenic hours. She said I should have read the updated guidelines posted in the HOA newsletter. The problem was simple. There was no such legal authority granting them access, and there was certainly no agreement that transferred rights over my driveway. But in her mind, authority didn't come from law, and it came from consensus, and the HOA had convinced itself that consensus was enough. I told her to move the vehicle. That was when the tone shifted. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't need to. She simply stated that I was disrupting community use of shared space and that she would be filing a complaint against me for obstruction. That was the moment I realized I wasn't sick dealing with confusion. I was dealing with entitlement, the kind that goes unchecked in communities where rules are enforced socially instead of legally, the kind that assumes silence equals permission. I went back inside briefly, not because I was retreating, but because I needed to confirm something I had suspected for a while. The property documents, the land survey, the legal boundaries, and when I pulled them out, everything became clear. The driveway, the access road, and even part of the scenic overlook they were using, and all legally fell under my ownership. Not HOA land, not shared property, and mine is fine, and they had just turned it into a public event space without permission. I sat there for a moment, realizing what this meant. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, this was a legal violation, and worse for them, it was documented because every second of it had been recorded on multiple cameras. When I stepped back outside, nothing had changed. The SUV was still parking in the driveway, the HOA group was still enjoying the view, and the president still looked completely convinced she was in control. But something in me had already shifted, because now I wasn't reacting, I was preparing, and what she didn't realize yet was simple. She hadn't just blocked the driveway, she had activated a legal chain reaction that she would not be able to stop. What should have ended as a simple property dispute quickly evolved into something far more calculated on their side and far more serious on mine. Because instead of moving the vehicle, instead of acknowledging any possibility of error, the HOA president did something that revealed exactly how far they were willing to go. She escalated it. Within an hour of me stepping back inside after reviewing my legal documents, I started noticing more activity outside through the security feeds, more cars arriving, more residents gathering, and what looked like an impromptu HOA inspection committee forming right at the entrance of my property. It wasn't random, it was coordinated. They weren't leaving. In fact, they were reinforcing their presence. A second SUV arrived and parked in a way that further restricted access. Folding tables were set up near the edge of the driveway, like they were preparing paperwork or conducting an official review. The entire scene shifted from casual gathering to organized assertion of control, and the most disturbing part was how normal they believed it all was. From their perspective, this wasn't trespassing, this was governance, this was community enforcement. This was authority in action. I remember watching the live camera feed and feeling something shift internally, not anger, not panic, but clarity. The kind that comes when you realize the people you're dealing with are not operating within the same framework of reality. They genuinely believed they had jurisdiction over my land, and the HOA president in particular had doubled down on that belief. She began speaking to neighbors as if she were explaining policy, gesturing toward the driveway and pointing at the road, framing the situation as if I were the one resisting a long-standing community agreement. It was impressive in a disturbing way how quickly narrative can override fact when enough people agree to ignore evidence. Meanwhile, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them again emotionally, not because I was backing down, but because I understood something they didn't. This was no longer a neighbor dispute, this was documentation in progress. Every minute they stayed, Every vehicle they added, every statement they made while occupying my driveway was being recorded across multiple security systems, time-stamped and stored off-site. They were building my case for me. Still, the HOA president wasn't done. By mid-morning, she escalated further by sending an official-looking notice to my property mailbox, and I retrieved it only briefly, already expecting the tone before opening it. It was a violation notice accusing me of obstructing shared scenic access and claiming I had altered or restricted community easement rights. The confidence in the document was almost impressive, because it referenced bylaws that didn't apply to my parcel of land, and it cited regulations that had no legal standing over private property boundaries. And most importantly, it ignored the recorded survey map that clearly defined ownership lines. Extending beyond what the HOA believed they controlled, they weren't just wrong, they were officially wrong, and that distinction mattered. Outside, the situation continued evolving. More neighbors began arriving, some curious, some supportive of the HOA stance, others clearly confused but unwilling to question the unfolding authority display. The HOA president thrived in that environment. She positioned herself at the center of attention, like a coordinator managing a public event rather than a property dispute. And every time she spoke, the narrative hardened further. At one point, she directed attention toward my home as if it was the source of disruption rather than the blocked driveway. That subtle psychological shift was intentional. It reframed the conflict away from trespass and toward perceived non-compliance. It was strategy, not chaos. And that's when I realized something important. She wasn't improvising. She had done this before, not necessarily with my property, but with the system itself. With enough confidence and enough community backing, she had likely enforced rules that existed only in interpretation, not law. And no one had challenged her properly, and until now. Inside my home, I pulled up additional records, deeds, title filings, boundary confirmations, historical access agreements dating back decades before the HOA even existed in its current form. And there it was again, clear, documented ownership of the entire access road, not shared, not conditional, not restricted. Mine assessed what the HOA had been treating as a scenic community feature was legally a private access route tied directly to my property deed, which meant every single vehicle parked there was trespassing. Every table they had set up was unauthorized occupation, and every notice they had issued was legally meaningless. But I didn't act immediately because the mistake they were making wasn't just legal, and it was strategic. They had turned a simple misunderstanding into a public demonstration, and public demonstrations require audiences, which meant the longer they stayed, the more visible their actions became, and visibility in legal disputes like this is everything. By late afternoon, the atmosphere outside shifted again. The HOA president began speaking more firmly, now treating the situation as an ongoing enforcement action. She appeared increasingly confident that I would eventually concede based on pressure or social conformity, but something subtle began to change among the neighbors. Confusion replaced agreement, curiosity replaced compliance. People started noticing inconsistencies in her claims. The boundaries she pointed to didn't align with visible markers. The shared access she described didn't appear in any publicly known maps. 9. And slowly, the narrative she was trying to build began to weaken, not because I intervened, but because reality doesn't hold still under scrutiny for long. Meanwhile, I remained inside, observing, documenting, and waiting for the moment when their confidence would outrun their understanding. Because that moment always comes, and when it does, it changes everything. And the HOA president believed she was controlling a community space, but in reality, she was standing on privately owned ground, surrounded by witnesses, recording devices, and legal documentation she had never bothered to verify. And I knew eventually that contradiction would collapse, not loudly, but decisively, and when it did, she would realize something far more damaging than inconvenience. She would realize she had built her entire authority on a mistake she never confirmed. By the time the sun started lowering over the cliffside horizon, the situation outside my property had stopped looking like a misunderstanding and started looking like something far more dangerous for the people involved in it. Not dangerous in a dramatic sense, dangerous in a legal sense, because while the HOA continued operating under the belief that authority came from repetition and confidence, I had already moved into something far more structured. Evidence, KPO, documentation, verification, and most importantly, escalation through the correct channels that they had completely underestimated. Inside my home, the calm was almost surreal compared to the growing activity outside. Security feeds showed continual occupation of the driveway and vehicles still positioned as barriers. People still gathered in small clusters, now more divided in tone than before. Some still aligned with the HOA president's version of events, others were beginning to question why a supposedly shared Scenic Access Road had no visible public designation, no signage, and no external confirmation from any municipal source. 10. That doubt mattered. Doubt spreads faster than authority when authority is not grounded in fact. And what I had in front of me was not just doubt, it was contradiction, layered on contradiction. The HOS claim rested entirely on the assumption that the Cliffside Road was part of a community managed easement, but the property records I had pulled earlier painted a completely different picture. The land survey didn't just show ownership, it showed historical continuity, decades of legal classification confirming that the access road from the main gate all the way to the cliff edge had never been transferred into HOA jurisdiction. It had been adjacent to the development, not part of it. That distinction was everything because in property law, adjacency does not equal access rights. An assumption does not equal easement. I made copies of everything, multiple formats, certified extracts, time-stamped digital backups, the kind of documentation that doesn't just support a claim, it dismantles opposing narratives when introduced correctly. But I still didn't act immediately. Because one of the most important lessons in disputes like this is timing. Outside, the HOA president was still trying to maintain control of the narrative. She had shifted from explaining to reinforcing and repeating the same interpretation of rules louder and more firmly as if volume could compensate for legal absence. It was almost impressive how long she held the illusion together, but illusions always start to fracture when confronted with small inconsistencies, and those inconsistencies were beginning to appear. One neighbor was seen stepping away from the group and examining the driveway boundaries more carefully. Another was reviewing something on their phone, likely searching municipal zoning maps. Small individual actions, but collectively they formed a pattern. People were checking, not accepting, checking. 11. That shift is what always precedes collapse in community-driven authority systems. Because HOA power is not legal power in the traditional sense, it relies heavily on collective agreement. Once that agreement weakens, enforcement becomes symbolic rather than functional. And symbols don't hold against documented fact. Inside, I initiated the first formal step, a property attorney contact, not aggressive, not emotional, procedural. I provided the documentation, the footage, timestamps, and a concise summary of the situation. No exaggeration, no assumptions, just structured facts. Unauthorized occupation of private access road, false claim of easement rights, obstruction of property access, and issuance of invalid enforcement notice. The response I received was not dramatic, it was measured, and that was what made it significant. So, because professionals don't react emotionally to strong cases, they react structurally. What followed was the beginning of formal verification requests sent to county records offices and cross-checking ownership data, confirming boundary enforcement. validating whether any HOA authority extended into the property in question. And as those processes began, something subtle changed outside. The HOA president was still present and still confident, but her behavior started to show the first signs of friction. She was no longer just addressing neighbors, she was defending her position more frequently, reacting to questions rather than guiding them. That shift matters more than it looks like, because authority that needs constant defense is already weakening. By nightfall, the situation had evolved into something entirely different from the morning. The driveway was still blocked, but the energy had changed. Conversations were quieter, and group alignment was less uniform, and the certainty that had carried the HOA president earlier in the day was no longer being mirrored by everyone around her. 12. And without mirrored certainty, authority becomes fragile. Meanwhile, inside my home, I received confirmation that county records had flagged inconsistencies in the HOA's representation of the property boundaries. Not a final ruling yet, but enough to trigger deeper review. That was the turning point, not because anything had been resolved, but because the system had officially started looking. And once official systems begin looking, narratives stop mattering. Only records do. The HOA president didn't know that yet. From her perspective, she was still managing a community situation, still enforcing a shared interpretation of access rights, still believing that persistence would eventually lead to compliance. But what she didn't understand was that she was no longer operating in a closed system. She was now inside a documented escalation chain, and every hour that passed made reversal harder. The cliffside wind picked up as night settled in, and the ocean below reflected the last traces of daylight. My property remained quiet inside, but outside, the tension had shifted into something more uncertain. Not confrontation, not a resolution, but anticipation, because everyone present, whether they admitted it or not, was beginning to sense the same thing. This situation was no longer going to end the way it started. And somewhere in the distance of that realization, the first real crack in the HOA's confidence finally became visible. By the time everything reached its final stage, the cliffside that once felt like a peaceful luxury escape had turned into something else entirely. Not chaotic, not violent, but heavy in a way that only comes when truth finally finishes cutting through months of misplaced confidence. And the HOA had spent so long operating on assumption that they never prepared for verification. And verification had arrived. 13. The official county confirmation came quietly, without drama, without announcement, without any emotional build-up, just a structured legal acknowledgement that changed everything in a single stroke. The access road, including the entire driveway stretch leading to my property, was privately owned fully and legally, without shared easement rights, without HOA jurisdiction, and without ambiguity. There was no interpretation left, only correction, and that correction had consequences. Back at the cliffside property, the atmosphere had already begun to shift before most people even understood why. The HOA president was still trying to maintain composure, still attempting to frame the situation as a misunderstanding of administrative boundaries, but the energy around her had changed, and people weren't following her tone anymore. And they were checking facts, and facts don't require leadership, they require a leading. One by one, residents began stepping away from the blocked driveway area, not dramatically, not in protest, just slowly as realization settled in. Phones were pulled out, property maps were reviewed, and conversations turned quieter, shorter, more uncertain. The illusion of authority was dissolving in real time, and she felt it. It always shows in subtle ways. First, the hesitation before speaking, the longer pauses between explanations, the repeated attempts to reassert control over a narrative that no longer has an audience. By the time the second official notice arrived, this time from a legal representative confirming unauthorized obstruction of private access and required immediate removal of all vehicles and structures, the shift became irreversible. There was no debate anymore, so only compliance. 14. Reluctantly, at first, vehicles were repositioned. The red SUV that had once symbolized control was started up and moved away from the driveway, and folding tables disappeared. The small staged gathering dissolved into scattered individuals trying to make sense of how confidently they had supported something that wasn't theirs to enforce. And then came the silence. Not peaceful silence, empty silence. The kind that follows a system, realizing it no longer has authority over the space it assumed it controlled. The HOA president remained for a moment longer than everyone else, still trying to hold on to interpretation, still trying to salvage the narrative she had built. But narratives collapse quickly when there is no audience left willing to maintain them. And eventually, even she left, not defeated in a dramatic way, just exposed. Inside my home, I finally stepped outside for the first time in what felt like days, even though it had only been a sequence of escalating hours. The driveway was clear again. Not just physically, but symbolically, the space that had been turned into an unauthorized stage was returned to its original function: private access. Nothing more, nothing less. Later, formal follow-up actions were taken. The HOA received official restrictions regarding any enforcement activity outside their legal boundary. Internal review processes were initiated within the association, and the incident itself became a reference point in local property governance discussions. But none of that was the real ending. The real ending was simpler: the realization that authority built on assumption doesn't survive contact with documentation, and the realization that silence is not agreement, it is just delay. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic in the neighborhood changed permanently. Not hostile, not dramatic, just corrected. Boundaries were no longer treated as flexible interpretations. Claims were no longer made casually. 15, and the HOA president, once confident in her informal authority, no longer operated with the same unchecked certainty. Because once people learn that something they assumed is wrong, they don't forget easily. For me, nothing about the property changed physically, but something changed fundamentally in how it was treated. Respect replaced assumption, and access replaced control. The cliffside returned to what it was always meant to be: quiet, private, and legally protected. And as the ocean continued to stretch endlessly beyond the edge of the property, it became clear that the real victory wasn't not confrontation or escalation. It was correction, because in the end, the most powerful form of revenge was never loud. It was simply proving with undeniable clarity that you were right all along. And that was the moment everything changed. Not through anger, not through chaos, but through documentation, patience, and timing. If this story made you think about how often people assume authority without checking facts, then you already understand why this situation mattered. Because it happens more often than people think. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, subscribe for more HOA, revenge and real life drama stories, and drop a comment with your own experience, because some of the most unbelievable conflicts always start in the most ordinary neighborhoods.